So you have a system that is, I mean, clearly and mathematically broken. Societal gears are just grinding, and people at the bottom are getting crushed.
Right, completely crushed.
And then a reformer steps in, someone who says, you know, the way we are doing things is inherently unfair, and the underlying architecture of our economy has to change.
Yeah.
And the historical regularity here, the pattern that repeats almost like a physical law, is that the very first people to aggressively, I mean, violently reject that message are the affluent, the comfortable class.
It is an absolute constant. And what makes Allama Parvez's analysis of this text, specifically his lecture on Surah Sabah, so piercing, is that he refuses to treat this as just, a mere historical coincidence.
Right.
He identifies this early ferocious pushback as a rigid, inescapable sociological law.
Wow.
Because whenever society attempts to reform a flawed extractive structure, the resistance doesn't bubble up from the confused masses. It is orchestrated directly from the penthouse.
I want to pull this apart immediately because on the surface, it sounds intuitive, right? It's like a rigged game of Monopoly.
That's a great way to put it.
Right, like if you already own Boardwalk and Park Place and you've got hotels on all the green properties, you're never going to vote to reset the board. You're winning.
Exactly. You'd fight to keep the rules the same.
But the text insists that this opposition always clusters at the very top, which implies something deeper than just, I don't know, individual greed. I mean, is Parvez arguing that every wealthy person is inherently malicious? Or is there a structural mechanism at play here?
It is entirely structural, which is a really crucial distinction to make.
Yeah.
Parvez zeroes in on a specific term the text uses to describe this class of people, the Mutrafuha.
The Mutrafuha, okay.
Yeah, and historically, people have casually translated this as just the rich or the prosperous.
Sure.
But Parvez argues that kind of translation is a massive oversimplification. It obscures the actual economic engine of the problem.
Because the rich paints with way too broad a brush. I mean, if you define the Mutrafuha just as anyone with a healthy savings account, you kind of lose the sociological precision of the whole argument.
You do, yes. Parvez's definition of the Mutrafuha is strictly socio-economic, and it's entirely about the method of wealth accumulation.
Method? Okay, go on.
The Mutrafuha are those who are entirely invested in the existing distribution of wealth because they consume the fruits of other people's labor without producing anything themselves.
Oh, wow.
Right. They are the ultimate beneficiaries of an extractive system. They hold the capital, they hold the land, and they basically siphon off the surplus value created by the actual workers.
Let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly.
Yeah.
So we aren't talking about the person who works, say, 60 hours a week building a highly successful neighborhood bakery.
No, not at all.
Because they are actually producing something. We are talking about the conglomerate that owns the land the bakery sits on, charges exorbitant commercial rent, and extracts the value without ever touching a bag of flour or turning on an oven.
That is the exact distinction, yes. It is a class defined by extraction, not mere possession.
Right.
So when a reformer emerges, whether we are talking about ancient agrarian societies or modern hypercapitalist states, and their core message is that the system must be re-engineered so every worker gets the full just recompense for their labor, who hits the panic button first?
Well, the people whose entire existence is subsidized by not paying that full recompense.
Which is the Mutrafuha.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
a true reformer isn't asking for a philanthropic adjustment. They aren't asking for a new charity drive,
No, they're threatening the foundational mechanics of how this class survives and maintains its dominance.
Exactly. The reformer's blueprint is an existential threat to the extractive class's structural position, which makes their resistance instantaneous, absolute, and from their perspective, entirely rational.
I mean, from their perspective, it's pure survival.
Yes.
If your status, your comfort, and your generational power are predicated on the rules remaining exactly as they are, any talk of structural reform feels like a direct act of aggression.
Oh, absolutely.
But here's where I struggle with this framework a bit. Do they view themselves as the villains of the story? I mean, if you read historical accounts or look at modern corporate defense strategies, nobody wakes up and says, I am the parasite bleeding this system dry. Let me go fight the good guys.
No, nobody does that.
So how does this class justify fighting against an objective move towards societal fairness?
That is perhaps the most brilliant psychological insight in Parvez's reading. They absolutely do not view themselves as villains, not at all. They view themselves as the moral anchors of society. They justify their structural resistance through this profound collective psychological delusion. And the text captures this perfectly when it describes how the elite respond to the reformers' arrival.
Well,
They immediately point to the
they
scoreboard.
point to their wealth.
Now, their children, right?
Yes, they boast about their assets, their offspring, their influence, their followers, essentially, their numbers.
Yeah. And they draw a catastrophic, self-serving conclusion from this data. They basically say, we have more wealth, we have more power, therefore we cannot possibly be the ones doing something wrong, and we will not be punished.
Wow. They're literally using their balance sheets as character references.
That is the core fallacy right there.
Think about the psychological loop there for a second. They are saying, look at my net worth. Look at my market share. If my system were fundamentally flawed, or if my actions were immoral, the universe wouldn't have rewarded me so handsomely.
Exactly.
Therefore, my prosperity is undeniable, empirical proof of my righteousness.
Parwes exposes this as a lethal conflation of affluence and virtue. The Mutrafuha treat material success as a cosmic endorsement.
Right.
In their minds, wealth is not the byproduct of an engineered economic structure, it is a moral vindication. They read their market dominance as a divine thumbs up.
God, that is a terrifying worldview to go up against.
It really is.
Because if you genuinely believe your wealth is the universe's proof of your goodness, then any reformer trying to redistribute that wealth or change the system isn't just suggesting a new tax policy. They are attacking the natural moral order.
Which explains the ferocity of their opposition. If affluence equals righteousness, then the inverse must also be true in their minds. Poverty must equal moral failure.
Oh, man. But are they consciously lying to the public to protect their assets? Or are they, like, high on their own supply? Do they actually look in the mirror and see a saint just because the suit is expensive?
Parwes suggests it is a deep, internalized self-delusion, which honestly is infinitely more dangerous than simple, cynical deception.
How so?
Well, a cynic knows they are lying and might eventually compromise. A fanatic who believes their wealth is holy, they will fight to the death.
That makes sense.
When a society begins to equate net worth with moral worth, it completely loses its ability to self-correct. The architects of the system genuinely believe the machinery is working perfectly because it is rewarding them, and they have already decided they are the best people.
It is the ultimate confirmation bias. Like, the game is fair because I am winning and I am a good person. Anyone who is losing the game must simply be lacking in virtue or work ethic or divine favor.
Right, and to maintain that confirmation bias on a societal level, you cannot rely on brute force alone.
Sure.
Brute force police, militaries, private security is incredibly expensive and exhausting to maintain against a massive, exploited underclass. To make an unfair system truly sustainable across generations, the Mutrafuha need the oppressed to accept their oppression.
Right, they need buy-in.
They need the workers to believe the system is the natural, unchangeable order of the universe.
But how do you convince someone to accept being crushed by the gears? I mean, really?
You weaponize ideology and religion.
No.
Yeah. Parwes points out that the extractive elite always ally with or directly fund an ideological or religious establishment. And this establishment's primary job is to pacify the poor by rebranding their poverty.
Rebranding it.
Yes. They construct a theology where suffering and lack of resources are not signs of systemic failure, but actual virtues.
Oh, wow. Like, blessed are the destitute. They reframe poverty as a fast track to spiritual purity and an ultimate reward in the afterlife.
Exactly. They turn deprivation into a VIP ticket for the next world. Parwes critiques this severely. He shows how the introduction of these fabricated narratives, the romanticization of starvation, ensures the poor never question the economic plumbing that drained their resources in the first place.
If you're listening to this and wondering how that propaganda functions in real time, think about the mechanics of it for a second. It is incredibly insidious.
It is.
It's like someone stealing your dinner and then hiring a philosopher to stand next to you and convince you that fasting is the highest form of enlightenment.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Then eventually you stop fighting the thief and start thanking them for helping you achieve spiritual purity.
That is the exact mechanism. Because if you believe your poverty is a badge of honor, you are never going to demand a fair wage. You won't unionize. You won't strike. Because demanding material fairness would be framed as a moral failing, a sign of earthly greed that jeopardizes your afterlife. The Mutrafuha funds these ideological institutions because it is the cheapest security system money can buy.
That is wild. And while the poor are being sold this theology of deprivation, what is the ideological establishment selling to the wealthy? I mean, they obviously aren't telling the billionaires to starve themselves for financial purity.
No, of course not. The wealthy are offered a completely different, highly customized theological product. They are sold the illusion of transactional absolution.
Transactional absolution.
Yeah, the establishment tells them they can essentially buy their way into moral standing without ever dismantling the system that makes them rich.
Ah, this is where Parwes brings in the critique of superficial charity, right?
Yes, exactly.
The idea that giving a tiny fraction of your wealth, say a 2.5% donation, or funding a hospital wing, somehow purifies the entire hoard.
Yes, and Parwes uses a really grounding analogy for this. He compares this kind of fractional charity to buying a ticket for a train journey.
Let's explore that, because it highlights the absurdity of the elite mindset so well.
So the affluent individual writes the check, funds the monument, or pays their prescribed percentage. In their mind, they have purchased a ticket to moral righteousness.
Well.
But Parwes argues that a ticket is merely a piece of paper. It is a means to an end. A ticket is supposed to grant you access to a train, and that train is supposed to take you to a specific destination.
Right.
And in the context of the text, that destination is a just, equitable society where no human being is dependent or exploited.
But they never actually board the train.
Never. They buy the ticket, frame it, hang it in their boardroom, and sit perfectly comfortably on the station platform.
Wow.
They use the act of buying the ticket as a shield. The logic is, I gave my 2.5% to the designated charity, therefore the remaining 97.5%, which I extracted through monopolistic practices, wage suppression, and rent seeking, is now completely sanitized and untouchable.
It is literally a mechanism designed specifically to relieve guilt without triggering any structural change.
Precisely.
Because it is infinitely easier to write a massive check to build a free clinic than it is to look in the mirror and ask, why are the people working in my supply chain so underpaid and exhausted that they require a free clinic to survive?
And answering that question honestly is the one thing the Mutrafuha and their allied ideological institutions will avoid at all costs.
Yeah.
Because the answer requires dismantling the very engine of their wealth.
Right.
Parwes is relentless here. He demonstrates how these grand gestures of philanthropy act as smokescreens. They confuse the masses.
Oh, for sure.
The public sees the hospital wing with the billionaire's name on it and thinks, maybe the system isn't so bad. Look at this generosity. It completely neutralizes the momentum for real reform.
The layers of defense are staggering when you think about it. You have a society where the people in charge genuinely believe their net worth proves the system is divinely ordained.
Yes.
You have a massive underclass convinced that their suffering makes them holy. And you have occasional, highly publicized acts of philanthropy acting as a pressure valve to release systemic tension. When you map it out like that, it's a miracle any reformer ever gets a foothold.
Yeah.
You aren't just arguing against a tax rate. You're trying to shatter a deeply entrenched, multi-layered society-wide delusion.
Which forces the text to present a profound counter-argument. If we are to strip away this delusion, if we accept that wealth is not a divine thumbs up, and material success is not a scoreboard of human virtue, we are left with a vacuum.
Right, like what replaces it?
How do we explain the disparity? What actually dictates who gets what?
The text steps right into that vacuum. It answers the elite's boasting with a remarkably clinical statement about provision or risk.
Yes.
It states that provision is expanded or restricted according to a specific law.
This is where Parwes' interpretation becomes exceptionally rational. He strips away decades, even centuries, of theological mystery surrounding wealth distribution.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, the elite desperately want the public to believe that wealth is a mystical blessing bestowed upon a chosen few by an unknowable cosmic will. Parwes argues the text says the exact opposite.
So if it is not a mystical blessing, what is this law that expands and restricts provision?
The law is the economic infrastructure a society chooses to build. The distribution of wealth in any given nation is not an arbitrary reflection of individual souls. It is the direct mathematical output of the systemic rules that society has agreed upon or allowed to be imposed by force.
Oh, yeah, think about the implications of that. If wealth isn't a cosmic endorsement, it's like rainfall. Let's use a meteorological analogy.
I like that.
Rain does not fall on a specific farm because the dirt deserves it. A storm cloud doesn't look down at a patch of soil and say, that is a very moral, hardworking acre of land, I shall water it.
Right. The cloud operates on physics, not morality.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Rainfall is based on atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, and topography. It is a completely impersonal, systemic mechanism.
Yes.
The actual moral test The real measure of a society is what they do with the water once it hits the ground.
That's the crux of it.
Right. Have they engineered a fair irrigation system so that every farmer in the valley gets enough water to yield a crop? Or has one powerful family built a massive concrete dam upstream to capture all the rainfall for their private estate, while everyone downstream watches their fields turn to dust?
And if the patriarch of that powerful family stands on top of his dam, looks at his overflowing private reservoir and says, "Clearly the heavens favor me more than the people downstream," he is being utterly absurd.
He's just delusional.
The heavens didn't favor him, he just manipulated the plumbing. That is Parwez's central, devastating point about risk.
The plumbing, I love that.
The resources of the earth exist. How they are distributed depends entirely on the economic plumbing of the society.
So Parwez is completely dismantling the prosperity as proof fallacy.
He is tearing it out by the roots. He emphasizes that a rich man is not inherently blessed by the universe simply because his accounts are full, and a poor man is not condemned or cursed because his accounts are empty. The size of an individual's bank account is merely a reflection of their proximity to the levers of power within whatever specific economic plumbing they happen to live in.
This shifts the entire paradigm of poverty.
It really does.
If poverty isn't a moral failing, then you can't just tell the poor to pray harder or meditate more or adopt better habits of highly effective people to fix their situation. Because their situation isn't a result of bad habits. It is a result of a lack of leverage in a rigged system.
This means the distribution of resources is not a test of the individual. It is a test of the entire societal order. When the text says provision is governed by law, Parwez interprets that as a direct challenge to humanity. Study those laws. Understand the mechanics of your economy.
But I want to push back here, or at least play devil's advocate for the system we actually live in today.
Sure.
When Parwez talks about studying the laws of economics, does he acknowledge the concept of risk?
How do you mean?
Because the modern Mutrafuha, the venture capitalists or the factory owners, they will say, I didn't just steal this money, I took a massive financial risk. I put my capital on the line to build the factory. Doesn't that risk entitle me to a disproportionate share of the provision? Or does Parwez view that as just another form of extraction?
That is the pivotal defense of modern capitalism, and Parwez addresses the underlying mechanics of it head-on when he distinguishes between a labor-based system and a system based on riba.
Now, riba is a highly charged term. Usually people translate it strictly as usury or the charging of interest on a bank loan. Is Parwez just giving banking advice here?
He is going vastly deeper than retail banking. While traditional interpretations might limit riba to the interest rate on a mortgage, Parwez defines it as the entire foundational mechanism of an exploitative economy.
Okay, what does that look like?
For him, riba is any system where capital is allowed to multiply simply by virtue of being capital, without any accompanying physical or intellectual labor from the owner, while simultaneously extracting the surplus value created by the people who are doing the labor.
So it's the concept of passive wealth extraction as a whole.
Yes. Let's tackle your question about risk. In Parwez's framework, capital itself is sterile. Money is not a living organism.
Right.
If you lock 100 gold coins or $100 bills in a vault, they do not reproduce. When you open the vault a decade later, you still have exactly what you put in. Money does not spawn.
Right. It just sits there. So where does the growth or the return on investment actually come from that?
It comes from human labor. Someone, somewhere in the supply chain, actually produced something of tangible value. They mined the ore, they assembled the microchip, they grew the wheat.
Okay.
The system of riba, the system defended by the Mutrafuha, allows the person who holds the sterile capital to siphon off the value generated by that living labor, justifying it by claiming risk. But Parwez argues that the risk of losing sterile capital does not morally equate to the right to permanently extract the life, energy, and labor of another human being.
Because the worker is also taking a risk. They're risking their time, their physical health, their limited lifespan on Earth to build the product.
Exactly. Parwez contrasts this extractive mechanism with the ideal system proposed by the reformer, which is purely labor-based.
How does that work?
In a just system, reward is intrinsically tied to effort and production. Every individual capable of working must contribute, and they are entitled to the full, unextracted measure of what their labor produces.
But the Mutrafuha would argue they do operate a labor-based system. They would say, hey, I pay my workers a wage, we signed a contract, they do the labor, I give them the wage, fair exchange.
Yeah.
How does Parwez dismantle the concept of the wage?
By analyzing the power dynamics of how that wage is set, He draws a massive, brightly lit distinction between a market wage and the full recompense of labor. In an extractive system, the Mutrafuha dictate the wage. And how do they arrive at that number? They do it by controlling the supply of life-sustaining necessities and weaponizing the desperation of the worker.
It's supply and demand, but applied to human survival.
Precisely. Imagine you own the only water source, and there is a line of 10 starving people who need work to buy water for their families today.
Right.
You do not offer them the actual mathematical value of the labor they will perform. You offer them the absolute bare minimum required to keep them alive so they can come back and work again tomorrow.
God, that's dark.
The worker is not negotiating from a position of equal rational market power. They are negotiating against the immediate threat of starvation. Parwez argues that any wage derived from this dynamic is not a fair exchange. It is an act of coercion.
It is literally extortion disguised as a contract, which brings us right back to the definition of the Mutrafuha. They rely entirely on that coercive imbalance.
They have to.
Because if those 10 workers were actually paid the full, true value of what they produced, the massive surplus of capital that the Mutrafuha used to buy their yachts, fund their political lobbyists, and build their hospital wings simply wouldn't exist.
Right.
Their entire gilded lifestyle is nothing more than the coagulated form of unpaid human labor.
That is a stark, almost brutal way to phrase it, but within Parwez's analytical framework, it is the exact reality. This is why the clash between the reformer and the elite is unavoidable and irreconcilable.
Yeah, there's no middle ground there.
The reformer is trying to re-engineer the plumbing so that water flows to every field based on the labor of the farmer. The elite are fighting to keep the dam closed, using the pressure of drought to force the farmers to work for drops.
And all the while, the elite are sitting on the dam, looking at their reservoir and telling the dying farmers, look how much the universe loves me. It is a perfectly sealed, hermetic loop of justification for an inherently violent reality.
Which is why breaking that loop requires more than just pointing out the math. If wealth is not the measure of a person, and if material success is actually just evidence of proximity to an unjust dam, society needs an entirely new metric for human value.
And that metric is what we see introduced as the text continues. It directly answers the question, if net worth doesn't matter, how does a person actually achieve standing or nearness to the ideal?
Yes.
The text explicitly negates the boast of the elite. It says flat out, it is not your wealth or your sheer numbers that bring you close.
It strips away all the false indicators. Assets are irrelevant to your actual standing in the eyes of a just system.
So what replaces it? The text introduces the phrase, Amanu was amalu salihan, belief translated into right productive action.
This is a pivotal moment in Parwez's reading because he asks us to fundamentally rethink the concept of nearness.
Let's dig into nearness, because for most of human history, in a religious or philosophical context, nearness to the divine or the ideal is framed as something deeply mystical and isolated.
Right, like asceticism.
Exactly. We imagine a monk taking a vow of silence, sitting alone in a cave for 20 years, meditating to achieve some ethereal closeness to the universe. It is intensely private and completely disconnected from the messy reality of economics.
Parwez rejects that mystical isolation entirely. In this framework, nearness is intensely practical, deeply social, and entirely socio-economic.
Really? How so?
To be near is to be actively, physically in alignment with the collective good. It means engaging in the hard, unglamorous work of building the just infrastructure we've been discussing.
Okay, so it's action-oriented.
Completely. Your standing as a human being is not measured by the depth of your meditation or the size of your bank balance. It is measured by the tangible weight of your deeds in service to the community.
If you are listening to this right now and trying to apply it to modern life, think about how radical a shift this is. We are socially conditioned to extract status from accumulation.
We really are.
We seek status from the car we drive, the title on our door, the zip code of our house, all things we sit on or reside within. This text demands we completely relocate our source of status. You get 0 points for what you hoard. You only gain standing based on what you build, fix, or distribute for the collective.
It requires a massive transition from a mindset of passive accumulation to one of active, productive contribution. If the ultimate goal is a society devoid of exploitation and dependency, then your nearness to the ideal is calculated strictly by how much friction you are removing from the system.
But I have to ask about the distinction between passive belief and active contribution.
Hmm.
Because I know plenty of people, and frankly, I can fall into this trap myself, who hold all the correct opinions.
Right.
We believe in equity. We believe in fair wages. We read the right books. We post the right infographics online. We have the belief. Doesn't holding the right ideological stance count for something?
According to Parwez's reading of this text, holding the right opinion is barely the starting line, and passive belief is effectively useless if it remains unmaterialized.
Wow, useless.
Yes. This goes back to the person who buys the train ticket but stays on the platform. You can believe the train is real. You can write poetry about how beautiful the destination is.
But you're still on the platform.
Exactly. If you do not pick up a hammer and help lay the tracks or shovel coal into the engine, your internal belief does absolutely nothing to alter the material reality of the world.
It's the difference between merely diagnosing a disease and actually administering the cure. The Mutrafuha might even acknowledge the disease.
Oh, they do all the time.
Right. They might host a black tie gala to raise awareness about income inequality,
Yeah.
but they will never engage in the productive action, the Amlu-Salahan of dismantling their own monopolies to actually cure it.
Because true productive action requires the sacrifice of disproportionate power. It means utilizing your intellect, your physical energy, and your resources not to build thicker walls around your private estate, but to fortify the foundation of the entire community.
And the text notes that for those who engage in this specific kind of labor, there is a multiplied or double reward.
The double reward, yes.
Yeah. Now, if we are staying true to Parwez's rational, non-mystical framework, this can't just be a magical accounting trick, right?
Yeah.
It's not a scenario where you help build a fair irrigation system and an invisible entity drops 2 gold coins into your pocket.
No, there is no magical multiplication here. The double reward is a description of observable socio-economic cause and effect.
Okay, walk me through it.
When individuals dedicate their lives to building a just, non-extractive system, they trigger a dual outcome. The first reward is macro. The society itself transforms. It becomes prosperous, stable, and critically free of fear.
Free of fear.
Yes. By actively dismantling the engines of poverty, wage theft, and exploitation, you are simultaneously dismantling the primary drivers of crime, desperation, and societal violence.
That makes perfect sense. If you build an economy where every single person has guaranteed access to the necessities of life through their fair labor, you eliminate the motive for a massive percentage of societal conflict.
Exactly.
You aren't just giving people money. You are engineering a safe environment. That is the first reward.
Yeah.
You get to live your life in a functioning, fearless world.
And that macro environment creates the conditions for the second, micro reward, the individual reward.
How does that manifest?
When you live in a society that is not dictated by artificial scarcity and the constant grinding terror of falling to the bottom of the hierarchy, your own human potential is suddenly unlocked.
I see the contrast here. In our current rigged system, even the people who are quote-unquote winning are miserable.
They are.
The Mutrafuha are paranoid. They are constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified of losing their leverage. They have to spend massive amounts of energy building higher gates, hiring PR firms to manage their image, and lobbying politicians to protect their monopolies. They are literally trapped by the very mechanisms they use to extract.
They are living in what Parwez would describe as a localized societal hell of their own design, regardless of how luxurious the furniture is. But in a just, balanced system, the immense human energy that was previously wasted on hoarding, defending, and panicking is freed up. It can be redirected toward actual human development.
That's incredible.
Your intellect expands, your creativity flourishes, your capacity for scientific or artistic exploration is untethered because your brain is no longer stuck in a permanent biological survival loop.
So the mechanics of the double reward are you do the hard work of fixing the systemic environment, and then the stabilized environment provides the soil for you to reach your maximum potential.
Yes.
It is an upward, self-reinforcing spiral. It is the exact opposite of the downward spiral of the extractive economy.
And this highlights why Parwez insists the distinction between these two systems, the extractive riba system and the productive labor system, is absolute. They cannot be blended.
You can't have both.
No. You cannot achieve the double reward while maintaining the underlying machinery of extraction. You cannot slap a thin veneer of corporate social responsibility over an economy that runs on wage suppression and expects society to heal. The fundamental direction of the mechanism must be reversed.
This analysis absolutely shreds the modern elite definition of success.
Mm-hmm.
We are taught that success is standing on top of a mountain of hoarded resources that you couldn't possibly consume in 10 lifetimes, while the people who built the mountain sleep in tents at the base.
That's the image, yeah.
But the text argues that true success, true standing and nearness, is participating in the construction of a landscape where there are no mountains of hoarded wealth and no tents.
Parwez frequently quotes a Persian philosophical line to summarize this ultimate objective. The goal is a world where no human being is subservient to another, and no human being is dependent on another. Everything else is secondary.
Wow.
Every policy, every law, every act of charity is merely a tool to achieve that specific end. If dependency and subservience are not decreasing, your tools are failing.
That is a brutally clarifying diagnostic tool. It cuts through all the political noise and economic jargon. You can look at any nation, any society, and ask one simple question. Is the dependency of the working class decreasing?
Exactly.
Is the extractive power of the elite decreasing? If the answer is no, then it does not matter how high the GDP is, how many billionaires the country produces, or how many grand philanthropic foundations exist. The societal plumbing is broken, and the system is failing the test.
Which is precisely the verdict the text delivers. The wealth of a nation is never the verdict of its morality. It is the material of the test itself.
This brings us to the synthesis, the climax of the narrative arc within these verses. The text does not just offer a polite socioeconomic critique that you can debate in a university seminar.
Far from it.
It issues a very stark, unyielding warning about the inevitable outcome for any society that fails this structural test.
Yes, the text turns its focus to those who actively try to outsmart the laws of equity. The Mutrafuha, who insist on maintaining their extractive grip, who doubled down on the delusion that their wealth, their legal loopholes, and their media monopolies can insulate them from consequence.
Well, what actually happens to them? Because history is full of extractive elites who seem to live long, comfortable lives and die quietly in their sleep. Does the universe eventually intervene?
The text states that their efforts will lead to ruin. But again, Parwez insists we do not read this as a threat of arbitrary magical punishment. There is no lightning bolt waiting behind a cloud. He frames this collapse as an inescapable scientific reality.
He uses a scientific metaphor here to drive the point home.
Yes. He points out that human beings cannot alter fundamental laws of nature through sheer willpower or wealth. You cannot command a block of ice to emit heat. You cannot legislate that arsenic function as a nourishing vitamin.
Right.
It contradicts their inherent structural properties.
It doesn't matter how many billions of dollars you have or how many lawyers you hire. You cannot bribe gravity. If you step off the roof, you are going to fall.
And in that exact same way, Parwez argues, you cannot construct a civilization based on exploitation, the extraction of unpaid labor, and the artificial hoarding of resources, and expect it to produce lasting peace, stability, or human flourishing. The foundational sociological laws of human nature will simply not allow it.
So the collapse of an extractive empire isn't a divine punishment from the outside. It is the structure simply collapsing under the unbearable weight of its own internal friction and contradictions.
It is systemic, mathematical, and inevitable. The Mutrafuha always believe they have built an impenetrable fortress. They look at their control of the legislature, their private security forces, their offshore accounts, and they say, we have engineered a system where no one can touch us.
But the rot is always internal.
Always. Parwez notes that it hollows out from within.
Think of it like over-farming a piece of land. If you were an extractive landlord, you might decide to maximize your short-term profit by forcing the farmers to plant the most nutrient-draining crops year after year, refusing to let the soil rest, refusing to reinvest in the ecosystem.
Right.
For a decade, you get record yields. You look like a genius. But eventually, the topsoil dies. It turns to dust. And when the wind comes, the soil blows away, leaving the land completely barren.
The landlord wasn't punished by the wind.
No. He was punished by his own refusal to respect the laws of the ecosystem. He engineered his own starvation.
That is a perfect realization of the concept. An extractive economy hollows out the core of the populace. It drains the literal lifeblood, the time, health, and purchasing power of the working class. And when the collapse finally happens, whether through economic depression, societal upheaval, or systemic failure, it often feels incredibly sudden to the people at the top.
Because they have spent generations insulating themselves from the reality of the rot.
Exactly. The warning sirens are always sounding. The rising poverty rates, the increased desperation, the localized friction, the collapsing infrastructure, these were all data points indicating the topsoil was dying.
But the Mutrafuha chose to ignore the sirens because they were entirely absorbed in admiring the reflection of their own perceived righteousness in their bank accounts.
Yes.
This circles us all the way back to the opening premise. The reformer walks into the city and says, "The structural integrity of this building is compromised. We have to redistribute the weight, fix the foundation, and change the laws of provision before the entire thing comes down on our heads."
Right.
And the people living in the penthouse, the Mutrafuha, look around at their marble floors and say, "Are you out of your mind? The view from up here is flawless. This building is a masterpiece."
They make the fatal error of mistaking their localized, insulated comfort for structural integrity. And because they refuse to yield, because they aggressively fight any attempt to redistribute the weight, the collapse of their system becomes a mathematical certainty.
This is an incredibly powerful, cohesive framework. Let's pull all these threads together to summarize the core narrative Parwaz extracts from these verses.
Let's do it.
So, the comfortable class structurally resists societal reform because true reform threatens their mechanism of extraction. To defend their position, they delude themselves into believing their material wealth is empirical proof of their moral righteousness.
Yes.
They then weaponize ideology to pacify the exploited, convincing them that poverty is a virtue and that superficial charity balances the scales of justice.
Exactly right.
But the reality is that the provision of resources, the risk, is a systemic variable governed by the economic laws we choose to enforce. True human standing, true nearness to the ideal, has absolutely nothing to do with what you hoard. It is measured entirely by your productive action in building a society free of dependency.
And if a society insists on fighting the fundamental laws of equity, its extractive engine will eventually tear itself apart.
That is the recurring, undeniable thesis Parwaz finds anchored in this text. It is a profound, rational, and deeply sobering analysis of human power dynamics.
It serves as a manual, really, telling us that every genuine movement for reform, every actual attempt to fix the plumbing of society rather than just handing out bottled water to the thirsty, must expect its fiercest, most well-funded, and most ideologically driven resistance to come from those it threatens to unseat.
Because the Mutrafuha aren't just protecting a pile of money, they are protecting their entire psychological worldview. They are protecting the deeply held delusion that they are the chosen ones. The resistance isn't an anomaly. It was the most predictable documented reaction in the history of human sociology.
And understanding that pattern is the first necessary step in actually dismantling it.
Which leads us with a truly lingering thought. We started this deep dive by talking about how hard it is to see the broken bones of a society when the surface looks clean. But Parwaz gives us an X-ray. He strips away the theological smokescreens and the philanthropic PR campaigns, and he shows us exactly where the fractures are.
He really does.
If you are listening to this, I want you to take this X-ray and hold it up to the world around you today. When you see an economic system starting to crack, when the societal friction gets too high and the topsoil starts blowing away, who is rushing to the microphones to defend that system by pointing to their own success? Who is saying, "The rules are perfectly fine, just look at how well I played the game." And more importantly, if wealth isn't the verdict, if it is purely a systemic test, how is our society actually scoring?